don't even have to bend over for myself. Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out to join us as we all stood there in the back and made fun of each other's headshots. You know, it's we're like one of those Pinterest, you know, fails, like, like, you know, expectation versus reality. No, I know that sounds so harsh. It's not intended to be. It's just, you know, we all look so smoldering and insightful. So, with that being said, thank you so much for coming to join us this evening. And for everybody who got a ticket through Eventbrite, your questions were in fact logged, and they were in fact provided to us. And so we've gone and compiled them into sort of the top ones we're going to cover this evening. However, I also know that whatever happens to come up in these kinds of conversations also means that there's other questions that come up. So I'm going to make sure that we leave time for questions from you as well, because no one wants to just listen to me. I know this for a fact. So with that being said, the world needs more strategists. Hopefully. Yeah, I hope so too. Oh, God. So with that being said, let's get started. So I think one of the really interesting, there's a lot of questions around what a strategist does, but one question in particular I thought was a really interesting way of articulating it, which was, how do you explain your job to people who aren't in the industry? Who wants to tackle that one first? Yeah, how do you tell your mom what you do?
All right, so... Hello? It's working, okay. How did I described it the other day to somebody? I said, I think it was my Uber driver in Dallas, and I said, she goes, what do you do for a living? She's a teacher. And I was just like, I don't know, I work in advertising. And she said, well, what do you do in advertising? And I said, well, basically it's my job to figure out how to manipulate people into believing or buying something they don't necessarily want to believe or buy. That's my job. So that's pretty cool. It's not too bad.
I'm more the optimist. We could have been business partners. You're the realist, I'm the optimist. I tend to say yeah, you are. I always like to think of it that we create the canvas for opportunity and possibility. There's my sunshine and roses view of the world.
I always think of it, or I would tell people, no matter what you're buying, there's probably more options than you need. And that really deserve to be there. So our job is to try to figure out whatever client we're working on in an incredibly competitive situation. How do we give them some sort of story or point of view or perspective that make them a little bit more interesting and compelling than the many other options you have to choose? Because functionally, they're probably pretty similar to, you know, whatever they're up against.
See, those are all, for all my verboseness, I always just say, it's my job to make shit make sense. I'm like, I make it make sense to the creatives, I make it make sense to the client. It's my job to be the interpreter of things. And so, because all the other explanations I had didn't make sense to anybody. So one of the other things that people asked a lot about was how everyone got their start. What made them want a role in strategy? Did you even want one? Or did you just sort of end up here? You want to take us through a little bit of your journey, your start as a strategist, and how you ended up to here?
Okay, I won't take that. Is this on? Here. Okay, thank you. I won't go through the whole circuitous route. I have actually been in this business since 1994. I don't even know. Some of you might not even have been born then. But it's funny. So actually, when I started in this industry, there was no discipline in Canada at that point, for the most part, that was known as strategy. So in fact, I actually was quite lucky. I started my career right out of university at Leo Burnett, and back then Leo Burnett had a program called the Black Pencil Academy, which, if anybody's ever heard of it, it literally was probably the Miami Ad School before the Miami Ad School ever existed. And this will make a lot of people jealous, but we essentially got to spend 6 months, or 4 out of 5 days a week. We got to take on all the different roles that were in an agency. We got to be creatives, we got to be account people, we got to do business planning. They really wanted us to be prepared for what we were facing. So I started out in a world where the account role was actually incredibly strategic. That was just what was expected of us. And really my route, and I think this is very true of a lot of strategists, there's not a traditional path, because I ended up heading down the digital space by accident. And again, when I talk about that, this was long, long before social media. This is when, like, we were literally making DVDs and websites, but there was no such, like, I was actually coding HTML myself because it was so basic. But fast forward probably 10 years past that, I was in digital for quite a long time. And what brought me into strategy is that there was a moment in my career, I took a leave of absence for a year. My husband and I, he wasn't my husband at the time, but we decided to travel around the world and just backpack and experience things. And it sounds so cliche and trite, but I had that moment of really thinking through what's next for me. And as I started to look at it, I realized, and I mean no disrespect to anyone who loves technology. Technology is amazing, but I realized I'd been immersed in it in quite a long time, and I had to ask myself what I really loved about it, and it had nothing to do with technology. It was because back then it was such a new canvas and space that I was getting the chance to actually consult with a lot of senior level executives on business strategy because they didn't understand that space and what it meant and the implications for their overall business. And that's when I had the epiphany that I thought, what I love doing is advising and consulting, looking at business from a more macro sense, carving out opportunity, like I'd said. And so when I came back, I was working at Cassette at the time, and they gave me the chance to parlay. I was heading up a digital division at the time, and they gave me the chance to move into strategy. So not a typical path, but that's how I ended up here.
Yeah, my story is actually pretty similar to Shari's, actually. Mine was not kind of directly into strategy because it didn't exist when I got out of school. It was a long time ago. I've been all over the place. I've worked in mergers and acquisitions. I've worked in financing Canadian content as an executive producer at a broadcaster. And it wasn't until probably, oh God, like 2000-something, 2006 maybe, that really planning and strategy became a bit of a function that people started to focus on. So as Shari said, they started to split. I had grown up pure play digital, last year's critical mass, doing a lot of business analysis and kind of heavy website builds. And I started really gravitating more towards the marketing side, because it was like, we're building this big shit. Who's pushing anybody to it? Like, who's thinking about that? And nobody was thinking about it. So I started naturally thinking about it, and that just kind of, I found a place, and I started to create, and then same as Shari, became less interested in just the technology side and the digital side, and started saying, wait a minute, there's implications that are far broader. So what's happening in the world from a technology perspective actually has more social implications than it has technology implications. And so I started morphing that into more of a perspective on overall brand experience and communications experience.
So I actually started in strategy probably around 2007, I think, right as I was finishing undergrad. I was an English major, and my dad happened to be a client at John Street. And so through that connection, I was put in touch with then head of strategy at John Street, Emily, and Shari, you were there already. And I got an internship through that, and kind of fell in love with it and became pretty good at it fairly quickly. And I think it was because it felt like it was a job that was tied to what I liked about what I was doing in school. Like, I don't know if anyone here is an arts major or anything related to English literature, but it's like, how do you take something that's been written about by thousands of other people who are probably smarter than you, and your job is to come and bring some new perspective to it, like, position it in a different way. What have you seen in this that someone else hasn't seen? And that's kind of like positioning a beer brand in the beer store when there's 3,000 beers and you don't need another one. How do you bring something new to it? So that process of bringing something new, a fresh perspective, creativity to a large extent is what I kind of fell in love with strategy. And that happened to be at a time when John Street was very, and still is, very much at the forefront of kind of creative strategy as a discipline. And so I was able to learn from some really smart people, including Shari.
Actually, I think that brings up a really interesting point, just because I know often when I speak to people and they ask me, what did I study at school? And I'm always love telling people I have a Bachelor of Fine. I mean, I can also project, because I got my Bachelor of Fine Arts in theater design. And I worked as a stage manager and a dramaturg for many years. And I think that, to a degree, people always find that really interesting when they're like, how do you go from a career as like a backstage theater person and a person helping playwrights, make compelling work, to being a giant tech nerd? That's a long story, and this is not about me. What did Shari, what did you guys major in? I'm always curious.
I feel like there's going to be a theme, because I was an honors English and theater major, although I did end up going to biz school at Ivy. But I started in English and theater.
Let's see, what do I have? I did communications degree at University of Calgary with a double minor in Asian art. And it's super helpful, by the way, guys. I recommend every one of you jump out there and get one. And sociology.
Oh, we already know Jason.
No, I just always think it's really interesting, and it's not to say that having a background in, I did end up doing a post graduate degree in public relations, but I always think it's a really interesting, people often feel like their academic background is an impediment, and no, it's not. So there you go. If you were sitting here in this room with your degree in underwater basket weaving, and you were like, can I too work in advertising? The answer is yes, you can. So with that being said, actually, I think that leads really well into our next question. So if you are a person who has decided, like a Jason, that this is really what you want to do from the get-go, how does one break into strategy now as a career? How does one get started or find an entry-level position? Does anybody want to tackle that first?
From the guy? Yeah, where do you start?
Nepotism. That's one way. But I think probably intern. Yeah. Fine. Just get your dad to no. Well, I'll side story because it's a nepotism story, but.
But you took the internship and you turned it into a job, so you obviously knew what
Well,
You have to turn this down at first.
Oh.
We finished the internship, and Emily and I connived to say, how do we keep Jason here? Because he had only finished the first year of his master's degree. He was finishing it, and he was like, I love it here, but I want to be a professor. This is like my true love. We tried to offer him a job, and we were like, what can we do? And then you did go back and finish your master's, but it was our happiest day when Jason called us back and said, I actually think I do want to come work with you guys if the offer's still open.
There. Well, that's awfully nice. But so there's a couple ways. Like obviously, internships are more and more being offered by more and more agencies, and they're important, especially in strategy, because you do need to get a sense of what someone's capable of before you're able to throw them into it. And so internships allow you to learn kind of what the role of a strategist is. I got some really great advice early on that you won't even know what your job is for like at least a year into this. And it was so true, and also really comforting, because it made those moments in that first year where it's like, oh man, I don't know what to do here, normal in some way, and kind of acceptable. But I think internships are a good way to kind of ease into things. Obviously, a lot of people will move over from other spots in an agency if they express an interest and kind of an inclination and a talent for the more strategic side of things. And then I think there's some interesting avenues like if the goal is advertising strategists, there are strategy roles in virtually any company or organization. So I know when I'm hiring, I'm not necessarily just looking at someone who's an advertising strategist. It's like who has some strategy and strategic thinking experience that could be translated in a way that maybe is different from anyone else on the team.
I was joking about nepotism, but I kind of wasn't. Toronto's actually, it was funny. When Donald Trump got elected in the United States, I got all these calls from New York, and people were just ready to run out of that country. And but they were having a tough time breaking through. Nobody's returning their calls, and they're like, I don't understand what's going on. I have like 100 lines. Why is nobody returning my call? And I said, well, welcome to Toronto. Toronto's a very insular, very difficult place to break into. People are not really risk takers. They're not really creative when it comes to opportunities for people that don't necessarily fit the mold or haven't been there. And so my piece of advice is just to hustle to get to know people and to get people to champion you, because there's a lot. I mean, honestly, I sit there every day. I get like tons of requests to meet people, to talk to people. There's a lot of people that want this job, and when you're in the job and you're so busy, you get all those requests and all those emails, but you don't have time to answer them all, and then you forget about that person 2 minutes later. But if Shari calls me up and says, Jay, I have somebody, you have to meet them, I'm meeting that person because I trust Shari. So there's shortcuts, and I'm kind of being flippant, but I'm not being flippant. It's probably the best way. So doing the work, coming to these events, meeting people, talking to people is probably the best way, the most accurate way to get through. And then I think, understanding the industry, knowing the people, knowing the work, having a perspective on where you want to work and why I think is important, understanding their values. Sorry, I'm ignoring this whole side. Hey, Jane. But having a perspective on the work and the people you want to work with and why, I think is critical. Those people want to know that you want to be there, but they also want to know why you want to be there. And if you have that perspective, I think it just goes a million miles to helping you get that opportunity.
And I'd say don't be deterred if, Jay kind of touched on this, like if you reach out to us, we're running companies, we're leading a lot of things, and we do try to be as generous with our time as we can, but it can be difficult. So what I would also say is do your research and look to see who are the people that are working with us. And I know a lot of people come in, a number of people know Sarah Phillips on my team, who's a strategy director. She actually teaches here at the school. And she also is making time all the time to meet people. And as Jay said, what you don't realize is she'll come to me and say, oh, there was somebody really interesting. Let's keep them on our radar. Just finding kind of all those different ways in and meet all different people. And the other really important piece of advice I'll give is be prepared for those meetings, though, because it doesn't matter if it's us as owners of companies or if it's a strategy director or if it's a strategy intern even. Just know who you're going to meet and think of just at least 2 to 3 really smart questions you want to ask them so you use that time wisely. The worst thing is when any of us or anybody on our team makes time and you sit down with them and then just say, so what do I need to know? How do I get a job? What can you tell me? Because I believe very much that one of the skills I look for in great strategists is the ability to ask a great question. You saw in the earlier presentation, it's not just about asking why straight up, but do you ask questions in really interesting ways? Because that gives me an insight into how you think. So every single part of your interaction is really important.
Like the other thing that I totally agree with the person who wants to meet and then, doesn't really have a plan for that meeting or what they're hoping to get out of it. That's a missed opportunity. Like one thing to think about if you want a job as a strategist is what are you going to bring to the table for that team that maybe they don't have on that team already? And it's hard to think about that maybe when you don't have a practical agency experience. And so that's where you need to go to your life, like your life experience. What have you studied? Where have you traveled? What have you learned about people that might be a different perspective than anyone else that's part of this agency that we lead? Because we are never looking to hire someone who's the exact same as people we have on our team or ourselves. I think I could probably say that for everyone. So really, really think about positioning who you are because it's competitive, and that's actually our job. So if you can effectively position yourself in a meeting, it gives me a ton of confidence that you can position a brand, even if you don't have any brand experience.
I think, okay, yeah, we're back on. There we go. Actually, so that brings up a really, really interesting point. I'm sorry to throw a curveball at you. This isn't in the list. It just made me, we were talking about this. I know, because I'm an asshole like that. Also, yeah. This one is dangerous. Well, what? You're peeking. I'm just trying to do me up here. So I think this is a really interesting question, though, because when we're talking about this idea of we're looking for people with different perspectives or different ways of thinking or different approaches, when we're looking at the future of strategy and a room full of future and prospective strategists, what do you think agencies need? What do you think strategy teams need going forward? I realize not everyone's uniform, not everyone's the same, but looking at the landscape of strategy as we see it now, where do we think we should be looking towards, and where do you think the greatest opportunities are? What kind of people are we looking for? Because I know I have my own feelings on that, but... All right, then I will kick it off. I personally, so there was a couple of questions, for instance, around things like automation, artificial intelligence. Obviously, that is my jam. I have the thickest glasses, so I'm obviously the biggest nerd. It's also my job. But I actually think that, to me, I think one of the biggest areas that we as a collective can develop, and I think something that's really necessary, especially for strategy in Canada, is to look towards incorporating greater forms of intersectional diversity into strategy. So not just looking for like people with different perspectives, bringing people from different backgrounds, different areas, different ethnicities, gender presentation. I think that when we're looking at creating more compelling stories going forward, regardless of the medium that we're looking to take, I think that purposely looking to bring in different kinds of perspectives that are markedly different from our own, I think will be really helpful in helping us shape narratives going forward. That is what I think is required in the future, but that's just me. Is that heavy? So,
Very astute.
oh,
Very, very well.
would anyone like to jump in?
Skills to grow, or?
No, I think I look for some consistent themes in people, and in fact, in many young people particularly, I don't look for what you've done in the past. I look at a set of attributes. Pretty consistently, I've seen great things out of those attributes and people that can do this job. But then I have another layer which is different than me. It's kind of what Jason was saying, is I kind of told my team different than me, because you could have two people that look different on the surface but be very same or similar underneath. You want diversity of thought and diversity of experience and diversity of background to bring new ideas in and new lenses on a problem. And so regardless of what you're doing and what the output of the agency is, could be creative advertising, could be digital, whatever, you want people that just have a completely different look at the problem, because if you fill your team with too many people with the same ideas, then you have one output effectively, one opportunity.
I think it's funny because this is going back quite a long time. I think it's an example of how that's valuable, and even sometimes people didn't realize it. When I finished university, so I'm not exactly the most diverse-looking person. I am white. I have blonde hair. I graduated from the Ivy Business School. But when I was actually meeting with Leo Burnett when they were recruiting on campus, I had no experience on my resume. I didn't know what to put out there, and I actually didn't value a lot of my experience, but I gave them as part of my resume, here's some of my employment experience. And I remember I was sitting with them and they said, we're really interested, and I hadn't realized it at the time, but a lot of my classmates did come from wealthier backgrounds. They had spent a lot of time traveling the world. So I did not come from that background. I came from a very blue collar background, and from the age of 14, I'd been working, and I'd written on my resume that I'd worked at one of the first Taco Bells that had opened in Canada, and it was a test market, and they were trying to be almost what Chipotle is today. I had worked for Stats Canada when they were doing the census, but I went door to door and in neighborhoods kind of trying to gather information, and I even told them stories about how, like, when people wouldn't, like, there were some scary households I had to go to, and I was like this young 17-year-old, and people were catcalling me. And so what I would do, and I was a pretty trustworthy person, but I told them I would go home, and for people who I was afraid to go back to their house, I'd fill out their form on their behalf. So when I was meeting with them, I was like, so you think that Stats Canada information is pretty accurate, but I'm here to tell you maybe not so accurate. And they started asking me about my experience at Taco Bell, and I was like, why do they care about that? And we started talking, and I actually realized one of the reasons they said they hired me is they felt that I had some real world experience, but also I understood what it was just like to live like as an average person in Canada, who a lot of us get a bit detached from. So when Jason was talking about thinking about how you position yourself, and then when you marry that with the notion of diversity does have a lot of different lenses. And I think if you can talk about what that unique perspective is, what are those experiences, I love that. Like, I want somebody who surprises me. I want somebody who's also fun to sit and talk to. There's no right answers. Let's converse. And if I connect with you, but even more, like if I connect with you, but also if you surprise me, and those are the memorable conversations that we go away and go, okay, that was interesting. That's the kind of person I'd love to see on the team.
I like that. So, but Taco Bell did not succeed in its aims to be Chipotle. Well, I mean, it's Taco Bell.
I was serving beer and wine. Like, we made everything from scratch, so clearly that revenue model didn't work for them. So I do not eat at Taco Bell anymore.
So if you didn't hear that, Shari confirms they do not make things from scratch at Taco Bell. I am so disappointed and surprised. And so I think actually while we're talking about, I think this is also a really interesting point into the next question, because there were a lot of lovely young account people who were attending this evening who would like to get into strategy. Also, shout out for the account people, because without you, I know I can't function. So thank you for being you. If you, I think for, and let's even take like account aside. Let's just, I think we can put it, if you are currently in a junior role at an agency and you are looking to make a move into strategy, how would you recommend someone go about this?
First of all, be amazing in your account service role. Because too many people are so focused on, I want to be a strategist, I want to be a strategist. Oh, all this account stuff is boring. Take advantage of the moment that you're in and the opportunity you have. You are, no matter how junior you are, you're immersed in somebody's business. Show how you can add value. Do that, but also at the same time, you're connected with strategists. Like, there are strategists in your agency, likely. They're the first ones you should be going out and having coffee with and getting advice from them. But be amazing in your job, because the worst examples are, I've had people before, and I won't give examples, I've worked at a few different agencies, but I've had people pawned off on me when somebody has said, well, they're not really working out in the account service department, but they've said they love strategy. And it's a bit disheartening to me when I have someone who feels like strategy is their ticket to some promised land. Strategy is also really hard work, and you got to roll up your sleeves. And in fact, especially at John Street, a lot of our strategists had come from the account service side, and we found that the best and brightest account service people brought so much discipline, great thinking, and they also knew how to sit down with a client and ask really smart questions and make those connections. So that would be my first piece of advice.
Yeah. Let's see, what can I say? Account people. I think the first thing for any good account person is what Shari was saying, is like, do your job and do it well. You're young and you have a lot of time to become the thing you think you want to become, right? And I think a lot of people want to become strategists not knowing exactly why they want to become strategists. It just sounds like the sexiest thing to be right now. And I get a lot of those people come to me, I want to be a strategist. Why? Because it's like super cool. That doesn't cut it. And you're going to be really disappointed, because it's actually, as Shari said, it's a tough job. It's a job in the agency where you're kind of the tip of the spear and you get your butt kicked quite a bit. By the creatives, by the account people, by the client, right? And if you're not a tough personality, you're gonna have a tough time in that job. So really know what you wanna get yourself into, I think, first and foremost. And the best way to do that is to spend your time at the agency appropriately in your job, and also keep an eye on what's going on with the strategists that are leading the strategy department at your agency. Which leads me to part two, which is everybody in agency is strategic. The best creatives are strategic, the best account people are strategic, and the best strategists are all strategic. Everybody.
Strategists who are not strategic.
There are strategists that are not strategic. But that's an important point, because I think the best agencies and the ones that you see that are doing really well, and two of the individuals sitting beside me, there's a fluidity between roles in really good agencies right now. There's not a lot of opportunity just to sit in a cubicle and hide and be the strategist, and then you pass off your work. So the best strategists are also very creative, and they're also very good at account management. So having a diverse set of skills is probably one of the best things you could have as a strategist. So as a young person, don't rush yourself. If you want to be a strategist, great, keep an eye on it, work towards it, but develop your account management skills. And then part two of that, or part three, because I already said part two. Part three of that is you have to deprogram yourself. I find one of the biggest challenges with account people coming over to strategy is that most agencies will train account people to be client pleasers, and it's not a role you want to be a client pleaser in. That's not what you're getting paid for, right? You're getting paid to tell people things they might not want to hear. You're getting paid to see things differently than everybody else is seeing it. And so your job is not to please everybody. It's not to say yes to the client. It's not to say yes to the account people. It's not to say yes to the creative people. And that takes a lot of work and time. But I find that account people have been programmed to say yes to all those people, to keep everybody happy and moving forward. So it takes a lot to deprogram yourself from that.
Yeah, I mean, what both these guys said is great advice. To that point around deprogramming, like, the best account people aren't just client pleasers at the same time. Like, I think you can actually do many of the functions of a strategist in the role of an account person today. You can contribute to brand conversations, creative conversations. You can speak and communicate with clients in a way that demonstrates you are on their side, like you're trying to help them, and the way they're going to help them is by allowing the agency's expertise to actually be utilized to help the brand kind of get to a place where it needs to get to. And account people who can communicate in a strategic way. When those people put their hand up and say, hey, I'm interested in learning a bit more about strategy, are there any roles that I could take on while I'm doing my job, or is there anything I can help, competitive analysis, whatever it is? I'm much more interested in including someone who's already demonstrated a capacity for strategic thinking and communication to, take on some of those roles. Because the reality is, a lot of the times, strategy teams aren't as big as we'd love them to be. And for sure, an extra set of hands and brains are very helpful, but not if it's going to feel like it's work. Take your time. Prove that you have some of those transferable skills, and then pounce on that opportunity and ask how you can help. And if there's some trust that's been generated, you'll probably be brought in.
All right, again. I was doing the thing. I followed instructions. I think that brings us to a really interesting point, though, because I think you're right. A lot of strategy teams, obviously there's an ideal where, there's 2 accounts per strategist and everyone's working on their, big accounts all the time, but that's really not how it works out. For more junior strategists or people who are looking to really develop those skills, when teams are so lean, what advice would you give for someone who's looking for guidance or mentorship or an opportunity to grow when they don't necessarily have the oversight or the guidance? What kind of resources can they turn to? How can they help develop those skills to make them sharper, better?
So I think that is one of the greatest injustices of this industry right now, that there is so little mentorship and guidance with all the cost cutting that's happening and moving people out of the system, that we're losing so many of the some of the reasons why I'm sure all of us here can point to mentors that we had. I had the chance to learn from an amazing creative strategist as well as an amazing business strategist, and they gave me so many opportunities to stretch my skills. So I first of all think that's terrible. I saw that one question that said, well, what happens if you're a junior strategist and you have no senior leadership and no mentors? And I'm like, if that's how you feel about where you are, go work somewhere else. That is, but the other thing I would say is, so then the more practical, but it's not like everybody can run out and quit their jobs. So find people, find a mentor, just if that's, and figure out again what the give and take in the relationship is. What can you bring to it? Who do you want to talk to and get advice from? I think Jay or Jason talked about going out and having lots of coffees. One thing I did, I wasn't remarkably just able to be a strategist. I had tons of business experience and agency experience before I became a strategist. But one of the things I did was, and this is where education comes in, and it's where places like Miami Ad School and things like that can really augment you. This didn't exist when I started, but there was a program for me down in the US. I ended up getting an MSc in creativity and change leadership. It was the only program of its kind. And I dug into it a little bit, and it started off with just being a certificate. I was gonna have to take 4 courses. I was kind of new into strategy, and I was like, but I still need some more discipline. And I remember how much it cracked open for me in that I had a lot of the strategic thinking and thoughts and smarts, but I didn't necessarily have frameworks that helped me start to shape that and connect dots. And I found this program, it was referred to me, and I took that. I ended up parlaying it into an entire master's degree, but it doesn't have to be that either. Look around, there's programs like this, there's courses. You should always be doing lots of reading, and I would say with every person you have coffee with, ask them for one thing they'd suggest that you either read or someone you talk to or something you should delve into. It is unfortunate, you will have to probably become a little bit of your own teacher and advocate. There's not necessarily as many people putting you under their wings, but you'll have to seek them out. And they might not be somebody who has a title chief strategy officer. Look for people who just you really respect and you think you could learn from too.
Yeah, I think all those points are critical. And I would say, just to add to it a bit, look for a diversity of opinions, because the most important thing for yourself is forming your own opinion and a point of view on where things are going and how they should work. And the only way you're going to get there is if you kind of talk to different people, different perspectives. The other thing that I would suggest, and something that I think all of us do, is we obsess about the industry, unfortunately. We're really shitty people to hang out with outside of advertising, because we're still talking about advertising. All our friends are in advertising, everybody, because we live at work. But we obsess about advertising to the point where I spend a lot of my time reverse engineering strategies. So when I see Shari's work out in the world, I'm trying to figure out how she got to that. And I could probably write her deck for her and get pretty close to it. And the same with Jason. But I do that a lot, and I kind of recommend that to a lot of young people, is to look at ads, start training yourself to understand what was the thinking behind getting here, even if it's flawed, and especially when it's flawed. Like when it's flawed and understanding why it's flawed, but how they got to that place where everybody agreed that this is a good idea. The Pepsi ad with...
Sorry, I was like, but yeah, why? Like whenever you see something that's just really awful, I'm always like, why?
Why? It got there. It got there through some logic. So yeah,
Okay, sorry.
that's okay. No, it's like it got there through some logic. So figure that logic out. For two reasons: one, it helps you understand the process, but two, helps you understand how to avoid that in the future, because you just don't want to be creating that in the future.
Yeah, I don't have a ton to add because I think these guys said most of what I would have recommended. But to that last point, finding those really shitty brands and then thinking about like, oh well, what if I were working on that? What would I do? You know, and take one angle and then see is there a different angle, and you know, and think about that, because there are a lot of, and it's only going to increase, a lot of struggling brands where, you know, you always think from the outside that people really kind of have some master plan and vision and know what they're doing, and that everyone's smart, but not everyone's smart. Like a lot of times people are lost, you know, and so take that opportunity when you see all of these kind of flailing things around you, and think about, well, what would I do differently if I suddenly got an opportunity? Because before long you might. And then when you have conversations with people, you can start talking about those kinds of things you've put the time into thinking about, and it's again going to demonstrate that you have the capacity to do this kind of work. There's no other way to get that than through conversation or through seeing your work. And so, yeah, like putting the time in to be a student, I think, is really important. And of course, programs like this one give you a tangible output that aid in those conversations quite a bit.
I was going to say, I feel like that brings us into our next question. So I'm sorry I got so enthusiastic, but the why of bad creative is always like a fun thing for me, because I'm always like, what was the insight? What drew us to this point? I'm also fascinated with all the layers of approvals, like how did we actually, who signed off on all this stuff? But for me, it's always, what was the thing that informed this, right? And what was it actually grounded in? Because sometimes, well, oftentimes it's grounded in a certain optimism or positivity, and yet the output. But what I think is really interesting is that when we talk about the insight, there was actually a number of questions around the idea of the definition of an insight, and how do you define an insight, which is, of course, an enormous question. I know. Do you want?
Been starting a lot. I think you should start.
Yeah, let's start with Jason. Yeah, let's go last first.
Okay, this is where an English degree comes in handy. So I have had the chance to teach this Developing Insights course. So the good thing about teaching is it forces you to think about, like, oh, what do I actually think about that thing? I have to put that down on paper. Insight, break that word down. It means that you're getting a view from inside, right? Literally, it's an insight. I think insight is almost synonymous with intuition. It's I've somehow gotten into the head, or I've gotten behind the scenes of some situation or some behavior or some person. And it's funny because we talk about finding insights a lot. Like, I don't think you find insights. You find things that equip you to be able to be insightful. But insight is your human intuition for what people think, what people feel. You could have insight onto a situation. There's insight into political dynamics. There's insight into all sorts of things. It's an understanding, an intuitive understanding of something that once expressed, people would be like, yeah, that's true. I wouldn't have said that, but that is true. That's a deeper understanding of what's going on. So, yeah, I sometimes actually like to say intuition, like even versus, because it makes it more of a skill. Makes it more of a capacity than some output. Anyway, that's how I think of it.
Yeah, exact same thing. I think the way I define it very quickly is it explains the why behind what people think, do, behave, feel, whatever. right? It gets deeper into the, I guess, the behavioral psychology behind the actions and motivations of people.
And it also can sometimes, I think also in part of that too is not to always, I think sometimes probably one of the biggest downfalls of all strategists, so I'm not saying it, I'm referring to myself, probably everybody up here, we've had moments where we've probably over-intellectualize things, and then you suddenly look at it and go, God, what is this clusterfuck I've gotten into? And sometimes it's just, it really is a truth or a slightly different way of looking at a situation, because an insight can almost be a product insight. I was actually, like Jay said, we are always thinking advertising, so I was legitimately watching the Super Bowl. I have 2 sons and my husband, I was watching it. And all the horrible a lot of the horrible Canadian stuff that we had. But I had looked, while we were watching it, I was showing my kids some of the ads that were playing in the States. And it was like a stupid, fun, awesome spot. Not everybody might agree with me, but the Cheetos spot, which had the guy with orange Cheeto dust on his hands. And it was just that notion of, I feel like great insight is almost the way comedians think about situations. It's what makes a great comedian. But it was the notion of, if you have that orange dust on your hands, nobody wants you to go near any of their stuff or do anything. So it's you have permission to be lazy, essentially. And that was just kind of looking at a situation a bit differently. So I agree, it's intuition, and you will probably sometime, it's funny, that insight, somebody may have belabored over it, or it might have just been a spark that came off of something else that was in a brief that really kind of springboarded out to that.
That's why creative people are usually extremely insightful, and because you kind of have to be to get to creative work, especially if you have a brief that isn't particularly insightful. A lot of creatives have that kind of, they're creative strategists in many ways, and they're figuring out what will be an angle here that I think people would find interesting or compelling or whatever. So again, don't assume that the strategist is the sort of keeper of intuition about human behavior and psychology. It's that more often than not will emerge from conversations with people. So the idea of the lone wolf strategist off finding an insight is not really how it works in practice.
Yeah, it's funny. I've always said, especially when you're working with really good creative teams and you have a great partnership with them, and sometimes they'll come back with an idea, and you might trace it right back to the brief and go, that makes no sense coming from this brief at all. But if it's something that caught my attention and I think is really interesting, then I actually stop and go, okay, there could be something here that we missed in the brief, or just something that we overlooked. The worst kind of strategist, I think, is the kind of strategist, I guess it would be that white tower kind of strategist that goes, sorry, when I look at these words on the page, your work doesn't match this brief. Now, I see ideas that come back sometimes, and I'm like, nah, you're trying to win an award with that, or you're doing your own little thing that doesn't make any sense. But I do think, own intuition. We are also consumers and people, and if you hear something that you're that is awesome, then start thinking about why. What was the problem you were solving? Maybe it's solving that problem, but in a totally different way than you realized.
Yeah, and I think on that, the best briefs are conversations, as Jason said. So not even committing anything to paper until you've talked to the creative people you're trying to inspire, because you'll get to a really great place, but you'll also be able to do checks against their thinking and whether they're buying into it and whether they're getting excited by it. Another thing happens in that process too is they automatically start to create. Once they believe you've kind of agreed to a specific place, then their brain starts creating without them maybe even knowing they're creating. So they're able to get the ideas more accurately and quicker. Everything feels on brief. You have a tight presentation. Everybody's excited.
Thank you. In fact, you already covered my question about how we can help creatives be better with ideation. Look at you guys. You're so strategic. Well, actually, so I think there's also, and I promise, Shari, I won't start with you because you have the curse of being sat right next to me. You brought up the idea of, well, not the idea, the process of asking great questions in the research process, in the insight process, to uncover great ideas. What would be out of your careers? What's the some of the sort of best questions that you found that you asked, or some of the most surprising sort of turns you were like, oh, I should ask a question about this. That yielded something really unusual. If you can think back through your career, is there ever a moment where you were like, I never thought I'd ever hear those words coming out of my mouth, but the result of it was something really fantastic. Do you want to go first?
Sure.
All right.
learned this one really early on, which is just around like elimination or like deprivation questions. So like, if overnight this was gone, who would care and what would they care about? You know, that's actually a really effective question with clients. You know, as I've onboarded with new brands and I'm trying to figure out what the internal perspective is on that brand, I always ask that question of different stakeholders within an organization. Like, if tomorrow this brand died for whatever reason, who do you think would care? And like, what do you think they'd be missing most? And it's extremely enlightening when a client organization, very few people can kind of articulate something, because it means it's actually a very powerful way to help them understand why change is so necessary. And after that's been established, you usually have a pretty clear road to recommend some interesting things. Anyways, but that question of when something's gone, why does that matter? That's an interesting research question typically.
Handsy there, but I'm going to probably off-road a bit and provide a perspective that's probably not popular, but I'm not a big fan of research. I look for one thing in research, and that's emotional reaction to ideas, but I could care less what people say. And that's just my perspective. It's how I treat things. It's how I do things. Not recommending everybody goes out and says that or even behaves that way, but the reason I do that is because I fundamentally believe every time I've been in research, I have a group of people sitting in front of me who are telling me what they think I want to hear, even though I'm behind a plate of glass, and are playing a part. So, give an example, it did bring back the bees. We had to go do research to prove that people cared about bees. The theory was that people were afraid of bees because they sting. Just saying, we spent thousands of dollars proving that wrong. But it's a really interesting analogy story. What happened in the room was we had, I think it was 8 people, and 6 were women, 2 were guys. And in the process of talking about bees, the 2 guys in the room were telling us that they don't care about bees, but they were doing it in very colorful language and laughing and basically competing for who could tell the best joke. But effectively, the takeaway, if you just read the script, and what the clients took away was the men don't care about bees. That was the takeaway. And I said, hold on for a sec, like back up and look at what was happening in the room. Those 2 guys were competing for the attention of 6 women. So they were in a bit of a pissing match to see who could be funnier and get the attention, right? It wasn't about not caring about bees, it was about hypermasculinity presenting itself to look like they don't care, because caring is not a very masculine trait. So we basically got a false positive read on those guys. We have no idea what they think, right? Like that's what happened in that room. At the same time, we had a guy who said one of the 2 gentlemen said, advertising doesn't work on me. Every single article of clothing he was wearing was Nike. Just saying, like, of course it doesn't work on you, not at all. Nike just happened to fall on you. But that's why I kind of I look at it differently. Of course, we have to do it. Clients want you to do it. You go. But I always implore my clients to look for the physical reaction to an idea in that room. If people are uncomfortable, if they shift, if they smile, if they get excited, then that tells us a lot about how they're probably going to react in the wild. Of course, you're not going to get a great read, because often it's just a paragraph written by a terrible moderator, or it's an animatic, which looks ridiculous because nothing's ever going to look that way. So you're never going to truly get an emotional read. But everything I've done that's worked out really well for the brand and for me and for everybody involved, 0 research was done on it. Sick kids, 0 research. Our free questions, 0 research. Bring back the bees, research, but didn't tell us anything. So that's just my perspective on it.
I don't know that that's an unpopular point of view, because I'd word it differently. It's not that I don't believe in research. I think creative research is garbage. I think it's artificial environments. I think for all the reasons, we've all had a million experiences like that where you just aren't going to get a true read. I think the important thing, and when I'm working with clients, what I try to say is, let's do the really smart research and digging in non-traditional ways before we're even writing a brief. Let's find out what's going on in the world. It's not going to be in a focus group room with 8 people who came in for a sandwich and a Diet Coke. And it's amazing to me how much money they will drop without batting an eye on that kind of research, where it's like, let's do all the work prior to that. And that's where I think research can be quite powerful, finding totally different ways to do it.
100%.
Yeah, I knew that's what you meant. But I actually don't know that your view might be controversial with a number of clients, especially ones owned by very large multinationals, 3G, for example. And but yeah, I think I hate that we're in a world that seems so scared to take risks. So I agree. I think some of the most special work out there that's really, truly connected with people has, it might have come from a lot of smart thinking in advance, but it didn't come from testing it in a focus group.
Yeah, I find, and if I can add to that, I have a really, because of my background and what I do, I actually have a really different relationship to research. I have only ever been to one of these test events, and the snacks are dope, I will tell you that. And it was really interesting to me because exactly what Jay was touching on. I mean, the less elegant way of putting it is everybody lies. Everybody performs. Everybody does what they think you want them to do. And so while I don't depend on it entirely, for me, that's where data is so important. I look at data, I look at social listening. There is a performative aspect in that for sure. But I always like to ask the question of when a person says this, what are they trying to say and to who, right? It's that idea of a huge macro version of what those two guys were doing over the bees, right? Who are we performing for? What do we hope it says about us? And what can we take away from that about who this person is? The other question I know I always like to ask is, often when clients come to us with their market research that they've done, they have certain terms or definitions, and I always like to ask them, what does that mean to the target? Because when they say things like, well, the people we're going after always cook from scratch. Well, what does always from scratch mean to this person? What is from scratch? How far do we go down the rabbit hole of scratch? Like if they're making pasta, are they actually building this themselves? Are they adding the eggs and the flour, right? Or do they mean that they're stewing some tomatoes and then adding it to something that's dried? Or do they just, I don't know, add some tomato paste and some tomato cans and they're like, this is scratch sauce, right? I always like to ask us whenever we have clients who are like, this is what this product or this relationship means to the target. I always say, well, how do they define that? And when they view it in these words. So when you say from scratch, you have an idea of what that looks like. Is that shared by the target? And what does that mean for them? Because I usually find it's that space in between of what the ideal is versus what people actually perceive or do. That in the middle usually is where I find the thing that's most insightful is. And that's also where I find social data and back-end data really helpful. Because it's what people do when they think no one's looking. Or what they say when they think no one's listening. Sorry, that's really creepy. I'm listening. But it's true. I do find that I would never build an entire campaign on it, but I would certainly use that data to augment what I believe might work. So with that being said, I'm cognizant of time. I have no idea where. It's 8 o'clock-ish. So let's take some questions from you guys, because I'm sure you're sick of hearing from me. So does anybody? Yes, please. Do you want a microphone? Use your diaphragm.
So I have a question for Shari. You mentioned that before you actually write the brief, what you feel maybe compelled to do is to go out into the real world and get that type of research. So can you walk us through a little bit about what that looks like, how you go about doing that? What does that really mean?
Well, it's funny because there is no formula. First of all, it's incredibly different for every business, for every challenge. In fact, the very, very first thing we do, I love what you were saying about asking questions. So the very first thing we do when we sit down with a client, because that is what initiates something, is really we actually do more of a workshop with them before they don't come in with a client brief. And we use it to ask a ton of questions. And the very first thing we do before we even start digging and looking for stuff is a reframe. And we look at what is the problem they think they're solving, and let's just test that. And it might be I didn't mean test that like research. I just mean in the room through conversation. But because there's usually more to it, why they think they're solving a certain problem. And that can unlock things. And a lot of times we come out of those workshops with more questions than answers. And then that starts to dictate the path that we start digging into. So it might be, well, you say cooking from scratch. What is that? So then we might just do a quick and dirty, like, you can actually use online surveys, but my big thing with online surveys is just ask more interesting questions, not the rote ones, but you might be able to go out and ask a few questions like that. Or in a case like that, you might go, well, I think there's some people probably who use HelloFresh or like Chef's Plate and stuff and think that's cooking from scratch. I'm going to just go randomly find a few people and interview them for half an hour or 15 minutes. Then I might go, well, do people think, like it's really actually, it's not formal research at all. It's getting, and this is one of the fun parts about being a strategist. It's figuring out totally new and different ways that you can get at information. And don't just be a desk researcher. I actually think what Helen said is interesting because I do think social listening and you can get such interesting cues there. But then it's what else do you want to dig into? Get up from your desk. And sometimes it is asking some of your friends. And it's, there's an example. Do all of you guys know IDEO? In the room have heard of IDEO. They're kind of a product design firm. That was their provenance. Like they're quite a famous company worldwide. And they did, and they've been known for designing some of the most effective products in the world. And back in, I think it was in 2001 or 2002, Nightline, was that a show now? Anyway, it was one of those investigative shows, decided to follow them, and they gave them a very simple task. We want you to redesign one of the most basic objects, the everyday shopping cart. And for me, like I was fairly early in my career at that point, and I found that if you can actually find that video, it's old, but it's so interesting because they show kind of the mess of how everybody gets in a room and imagines possibilities. Sometimes you hypothesize stuff. It's not about backing up research, but sometimes we throw hypotheses on the table and then we go out and stress test them and go, did we make this up? Is it real? Is there something there? And one of the basic things they did is that the very first thing they said was, before we can redesign a grocery shopping cart, let's just go to the grocery store. And they set up people at the ends of aisles, and all they did, it kind of sounds boring, I think it sounds kind of exciting, like they spent, I think, 6 hours just watching people with their shopping carts and what they did. But they started themselves to define, no research would have given you this, like in a focus group room, power shoppers who like used a combination of like those hand baskets with a cart. And they would put 2 of those baskets in the cart, they'd park their cart at the end of the aisle, and then they'd run down the aisle because it was more mobile with that. And that was a very small sub-segment, but they're like, interesting. They saw parents and how they were using the cart with their kids and trying to control their kids. Like it can be as basic as getting out into the environment, if it's cars you're talking about, or if, exactly, it's really powerful. Does that help? It's, yeah. Yes.
You all seem to be on the same page regarding the state of mentorship in marketing in Canada. So just from like positions, you're all leaders in the industry and everything, what do you think might be the root cause of that? Just off the top of your head, I don't know. It's kind of
My short answer would be time. That's just me, though. I'm also here a lot anyway, so.
I mean, I think there's like official mentorship within agencies where it's like, oh, this is our professional development plan for our staff. That stuff seems to be going away for a few reasons. Probably time, probably budgets, probably all bad leadership, all those things. I don't think though that, like you mentioned Shari or Jay, one of you, that like we meet with people all the time. Like most people in this industry are very open to passing on what they've learned and helping. I think mentorship, might be very strong. I don't know. It's just not formally strong. It doesn't seem within agencies.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I would say also, like Shari and I said, we were kind of the first ones in this job. And I interestingly, I think there's a lot of opportunity right now for mentorship for a lot of you. But I think there was a kind of a gap in between probably us and then you, where we were trying to figure out what we're doing, right? We were just making up the rules as we went along because the world was changing quickly and the demands were pretty high on us. And we had to create this function that didn't exist in Canada. It exists in the UK and somewhat in the States, and then kind of trickled into Canada. So I think there was a gap. I think it's getting better, but to Jason's point, it's not formalized, I think, largely because of budgets, time pressures, and agencies forcing interns and young people into functioning roles before bringing them in to teach them. So I don't think there's a lot of, I guess, focus on teaching people is more about throwing you in to become a quote-unquote strategist?
Yeah, I think a common theme with the two of us was we had this intense desire to learn, and there weren't people necessarily there who could give us that. So we really, like what I would say is it's interesting, right? Because when you're young, it can be a very heady experience to have somebody give you a really big title. And I've found a lot of people out there worried much more about what's my title, and not maybe doing enough of a job digging around to see who are the people that are in that agency. And it might not necessarily be your direct boss. It's, are there learning opportunities? I think it's a great question to actually ask agencies, which are, how do you develop your junior people? What is your path? Are there formal education programs? Can I take training? Do you guys ever cover that? Are there people in the company who are designated to help? So that'll give you a sense of how much they value it. And I think part of it is actually realizing for yourself how important learning is, and then trying to find that. Because again, you will find there are still a lot of people out there who want to be teachers. I always just found it really frustrating when people are like, no, I just want the title. I'm not worried about learning. And unfortunately, there has been a shortage of, it's fortunate if you're coming into strategy, there has been a shortage of strategists. I think there's a ton of opportunity, but don't just jump at something because it sounds like a super great title. It's look for all those different things. And I really would say, see if your company, like the master's degree that I did, Cassette started paying for it for me, and then I left Cassette. And one of the negotiating things I did when I went to John Street was to ask if they would pick up the rest of the tab. And it's a good time to negotiate when they want you and you're just starting out, and you kind of, rather than being in it. So it's, you don't have to be greedy about it, but I think thinking about those things for yourself and really creating the why behind a certain course you might want to take can also be valuable, because they might not have the people, but if you can find something that's a great opportunity for maybe $2,500, we've both had experiences actually with companies helping to pay for some of our training.
And I also just want to add to that as well. We'll take 2 more questions, but I think that just in the same way that Shari and Jay are talking about how they were really kind of, to use a terrible analogy, paving the road as they were driving it. I was too, and although I came into the industry, I would say about 11 years ago, I came in through a discipline at the time that was super alien. Nobody thought that anyone was. Turns out social media is the thing, and the internet is here to stay, which is great because I like to get paid. But for me, it was always just like I didn't really have anybody at the agency who could teach me how to do what I was doing, because what I was doing, I was the only one who was doing it. But the reason why I'm telling you that is because we have a tendency of thinking as mentorship as this really like formalized relationship where we're looking to someone who's above you with a similar title who's going to sit down and be like, I'm going to polish you. I'm going to make you the shiniest turd, right? Like we're always hoping that someone's going to turn around and be like, you, right? And I think that the way to look at that is twofold. Is that one, mentorship comes from all sorts of different directions. For me, I have the technical know-how, but I was not, and still am not, particularly polished. And for me, a lot of the mentorship came from watching other people in the industry, how they carried themselves, how they talked to clients, how they were the best versions of themselves, and looking to that as an area for me to grow. And the other thing is, have you asked? Like, I know that sounds like a really stupid question, but have you looked around? Have you seen who's maybe a little bit more seasoned, a bit more experienced, who could help? Have you asked them? Because a lot of the time we don't. Right, we often think that mentorship has this very sort of specific look to it, and therefore, but if there's somebody who you respect and admire, who you think has a unique perspective, who you think has a lot to say, ask them, take them out for a coffee, pick their brains a little bit, right? Because you might be surprised, because mentorship, especially I think in our field where, so many of us come from such different perspectives and different backgrounds, someone to help you become a great strategist could look like anybody. So with that being said, is anyone over here? What? We'll go right at the back. Sorry, I'll come back. Come forward. Flowers, what's up?
With, say, smaller clients or client budgets kind of shrinking in the industry themselves, and clients requesting tactical executions, how would you convince or influence a client that investing in strategy is the right approach for them, or how to kind of bring them back to thinking more strategically as opposed to more tactically?
So it's interesting because you guys have probably noticed there's a lot of smaller offshoot indie agencies that have started. Jason and I happen to be examples of that, and you have your own strategy consulting firm as well. And so part of what's different when we go out and start our own thing, we have myself and my business partner, who's an executive creative director, we believe so much in something Jay said earlier, which is the best creatives are super strategic and the best strategists are really creative. We started together and we didn't make it an option. It's what we do. Like, it's one of the, when this started to become a discipline, the first phase that agencies went through that they struggled with was, they didn't even struggle with it. They just said, oh, we're just gonna do this, the strategy is a value add. We'll just do that for free. So we went through quite a period with a lot of big agencies where it wasn't actually being paid for. It was just considered this value add. I think now we're in a world where we just don't, we started with a value proposition that said strategy is really important. We're going to apply strategic thinking from the very beginning, even if it's tactical. We're going to ask you, why are you doing this? What's different? Why aren't people, like, we've had people come to us and say, I need an out-of-home campaign to tell everybody that we have the best customer service. Well, the first question we ask is, well, do you have the best customer service? And then let's talk about that a bit more. But I think what you're seeing is a new wave where strategy is just inherent to what we do, because within the advertising business, if we don't do that, then we're going to become less and less relevant and meaningful, and we won't command any type of budget from clients. I don't know if you guys, how do you guys feel?
I look at your question a bit differently, and just, I agree with everything Shari said. On top of that, I look at it through an economics lens, because that's what they're really asking about, is like, I don't want to pay any more money for this, and you're trying to figure out a way to charge for this. And I think the inherent problems with charging for time, I think that's where the folly is. And so you need to figure a way out of the hourly rate and into a different format of charging for the work. Then it doesn't matter what you provide. It's just a super strategic, comes with strategy, comes with creative, and they're not going to argue with it because there's value in it. So yeah, I just look at it as an economic problem, which is infinitely more challenging than solving for how do I get people to buy strategy.
But it's very true. We've never charged by the hour. The day we opened our doors, we said we will not charge an hourly rate, and we don't have an hourly rate.
Yeah, we haven't either. Same thing. So that does help.
100%.
Yeah.
It's an economic problem.
Yeah.
Let's solve that, so that's not what they're thinking about.
Yep.
You guys don't have to solve it.
Yeah.
We're working, your company.
The other thing, like, to think about would be if you're constantly getting really tactical briefs, let's say, it might be that your team or agency isn't thought of at the level of more strategic briefs. And so that either means you need to demonstrate a capacity for that, or figure out who's doing it. Like, every organization, even really, really chaotic ones, have some people whose job is to be thinking about, what's next. That's like how management teams are built. There's people for today and there's people for tomorrow, and you can bet that the C-suite is thinking strategically. I would hope. Some aren't, but I would hope, because that's their job. So it may just be that your clients aren't the right clients for the kind of strategic problems that you want to take on, that their jobs are to be doing tactical work.
That's actually a great point too. It's always difficult to change legacy opinions. So with every new piece of business, that's how you can start to change the conversation, the expectations of the relationship, and how you work and what you're going to bill for, basically.
Well, and as a digital strategist, I was going to say, also straddling the line between strategy and tactical is not so bad. I made a whole career out of it. So, all right, our last question. You keep raising your hand so optimistically. So
You have been talking about flexibility, different perspectives, creativity, curiosity. It's interesting because if you go, for example, to a bank sector, they say pretty much the same, or any profession. If you put all of this on the side, why the word needs more strategists?
yeah, tell them why they need more of us.
Well, so the world doesn't always feel like a particularly smart place. I don't see a ton of logic to the way a lot of things happen. And the role of strategists is to help people make better decisions, help smarter things happen. And yeah, like I can't imagine a world where we had fewer strategists. That'd be a pretty depressing world, more depressing than some of the stupid shit that happens today. All in every facet of life, right? Like you can probably, all of you can think of instances in your life where you made kind of poor strategic decisions, instances in other people's lives where they made poor strategic decisions that happen in business, in politics, all over the place, like they're everywhere. So the world needs more strategists to make better decisions so that it's a more comfortable place.
Oh, wow. I'll be a contrarian, and I'll say, imagine that. I'll say the world doesn't need more strategists, but we need better strategists. And what I'll point to is, like, I'm excited for whoever in this room wants to be a strategist, whoever's going to be a strategist, to be better than the three of us. And I look forward to that day. I'm like, I invite it, I want it, right? I really want people to push advertising to new limits. I think it's about to enter into a new renaissance soon. I think it's gone through a tough period, but I think it's going to go into a good place. And to help make that happen, I think it's going to need a lot of really smart thinkers because the pressure is going to be on time more than anything. So, the better strategists that we have in the industry, I think the more effective the work, the better the industry is going to do.
Yeah, just the final point I would put on it, there was a client that we started working with recently, and they'd actually done a formal pitch process, and they'd selected our agency, but then the VP that had been leading the process just said to us, his problem was that the co-founders still felt like they should be able to do that work inside, because it can almost feel insulting if you say, well, we're going to give all the strategic work outside of our organizations. And what we talked to them about, and then they ended up seeing the effects of it, is we said, we would never stand here and say that we're smarter than you. You guys know your business inside and out. You need to. But what we provide is an outsider advantage. Whether you call that naivety, we bring a different perspective. And if you always just operate with tunnel vision inside of your own world, we all know that, you're going to keep coming up with the same solutions and the same ways of doing things. And if we just circle back all the way to where Jason started when he said, it's about, in this sea of choice, it's like, how do you create those little incremental differences? Well, sometimes, again, I think all of my clients are brilliant in all different things. And what we do is maybe just shift the lens a bit, give them a different way to look at it, help them differentiate. And I think we all need that outsider advantage. And that's why I think the world needs, I would agree, better strategists, potentially more strategists. And I think they need to be welcomed and embraced as not an oppositional relationship, but a complementary one that moves things to new places.
And if I can just add to that before we conclude, I think for me, earlier I said I think that our role is making shit make sense, right? And I always say that I don't think that it's my role to judge whether or not something is good or bad. I mean, creative is different, but whether or not a perspective or a target or a behavior is good or bad, it's my job to first understand what it is, and then to help guide my clients through that process. Then what we hold true and is a fact today no longer has that same weight tomorrow. And so I always feel like it's my job, partly, and part of the reason why I think the world needs more strategists or better strategists, is to help people navigate the world, because we are evolving and changing and moving. It's such a fast pace, so much more than ever so before. And I feel like it's part of our role to help our clients navigate that point when the thing that they thought was true today no longer is tomorrow. And I think that that's why we need more of us, and ones with different perspectives that are smarter and better. That's my perspective. So with that being said, a big round of applause to Jason and Jay and Shari, because they had to put up with me. And thank you so much for your great questions and these great questions. Thanks, guys.